The modern world has developed a strange relationship with failure. It is treated as a glitch in the system, a detour from the path of success, or a verdict on a person's worth. In the digital age, failure is something to be hidden, edited out of the highlight reel, or spun into a polished narrative of immediate triumph. But the ancients viewed failure through a different lens. For the Roman mind, failure was not a dead end. It was a forge. It was the raw material of character, provided one possessed the architectural framework to withstand the weight of it. The Romans possessed a technology of the mind that has largely been lost to history. A system built on three pillars: Gravitas, the weight of dignity; Constantia, the steadiness of endurance; and the Stoic filter, the ability to separate the internal will from external circumstance. This system did not promise a life free of collapse. It promised something far more valuable. It promised the ability to rebuild. In the city of Boston, Massachusetts, the wind cuts off the Charles River with a serrated edge, particularly in the depths of February. It is a city obsessed with history and status, where the cobblestones speak of revolution and the brownstones whisper of old money. It is here that Nico Rodriguez lives, a man who has spent his life studying the architecture of the human mind, only to watch his own foundation crumble. At 37 years old, Nico was a clinical psychologist. He is a man who is supposed to have the answers. He is the person others turn to when their lives fracture. Yet, standing in his office on the 20th floor of a medical building on Boylston Street, looking out at the gray expanse of the city, he feels like a fraud. The diplomas on his wall, the framed licenses from prestigious institutions, they feel like props in a theater production where he has forgotten his lines. He is currently living in the aftermath of a profound professional failure, a misdiagnosis that shook his confidence and threatened his practice. To the outside world, he is still Dr. Rodriguez, a competent man in a tailored coat. Inside, he is navigating the labyrinth of shame, searching for a way to regain the self-respect that has quietly evaporated. Nico's existence in the Back Bay neighborhood of Boston follows a rhythm of quiet desperation. His morning routine, once a source of pride and discipline, has become a mechanical exercise in avoidance. The alarm on his phone sounds at 6 a.m., a harsh digital chirp that interrupts a sleep that is rarely restful. He rises in the dark, the radiator clanking in the corner of his apartment, a sound that seems to echo the rattling anxiety in his chest. He showers, shaves, and dresses in suits that cost more than his first car, each layer of fabric a disguise. He walks to work, passing the iconic brownstones, the iron fences slick with frost. He sees the joggers on the esplanade, the students rushing to classes at Berkeley, the tourists snapping photos of the public garden. They all seem to be moving with purpose. Nico feels he is merely drifting. His job as a clinical psychologist in a setting known for its academic and medical rigor is high pressure. He deals with high-functioning professionals, academics from MIT and Harvard, people who demand results and demand them quickly. For years, Nico thrived on this pressure. He was the anchor in the storm for his patients. He believed that if he could just be perfect, if he could just apply the right cognitive behavioral technique or the perfect interpretation, he could fix anyone. The stress of his specific role in Boston is a unique beast. He's not just a therapist. He's a high-end service provider in a city that intellectualizes emotion. His patients analyze his analysis. They challenge his credentials. They want data. And for a long time, Nico delivered. But 6 months ago, he missed something. It wasn't a lack of knowledge. It was a moment of burnout-induced blindness. He was treating a patient for severe anxiety when the underlying issue was early-onset psychosis with organic causes. By the time the physical symptoms became undeniable, the patient had been hospitalized. The family threatened a lawsuit. The board opened an inquiry, while the investigation eventually cleared him of gross negligence, citing the complexity of the case. The verdict in his own mind had already been passed. He was guilty. He felt he had failed the very duty he swore to uphold. He tried to fix the feeling of failure with modern means. He downloaded meditation apps that promised serenity in 10 minutes. He bought expensive self-help books that told him to let go and embrace his imperfections. He threw himself into his work with a frantic energy, taking on more clients to prove his worth. But the harder he tried to fix the problem, the deeper the pit of shame became. He was trying to patch a structural collapse with duct tape. The inciting incident that shattered his illusion of control happened on a Tuesday evening. He was sitting in his office, the sky outside his window turning a deep bruised purple. He had just finished a session with a new patient, a young lawyer who was struggling with imposter syndrome. As the lawyer spoke about feeling like a fake, about the terror of being exposed as incompetent, Nico felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He realized he could not offer a single piece of advice because he was drowning in the same water. He sat there frozen as the silence in the room grew heavy. He managed to mumble a few platitudes, but the session ended awkwardly. The lawyer left, looking unconvinced. Nico sat alone in his office for an hour after. He realized then that the problem was not the lawsuit, the board, or the difficult patient. The problem was structural. His entire sense of self-respect had been built on the premise of his own competence. He had built his identity on a foundation of glass, and a single stone had shattered it. He realized that letting go was not an option. He needed to rebuild the foundation. He needed a new way to be. He walked home that night under the flickering street lamps of Newbury Street, feeling the weight of his own inadequacy like a physical burden, unaware that the answer he was seeking was waiting for him in a place he had long ignored. The encounter came 3 days later, in a dusty corner of the Brattle Bookshop, one of the oldest antiquarian bookshops in the United States, tucked away in downtown Boston. Nico often wandered there on his lunch breaks, seeking refuge from the sterile environment at the hospital and the polished perfection of his office. He was looking for nothing in particular, just a distraction. His hand grazed a shelf of classical history, knocking a small, leather-bound volume to the floor. It was a translation of letters by Seneca, but it was a specific edition, annotated by a late 19th century scholar who focused on the military applications of Stoic philosophy. Nico picked it up. The book fell open to a passage about the Roman concept of gravitas. He had heard the term before, of course. In modern usage, it is often reduced to simply being serious or solemn, but the Latin root is gravis, meaning heavy. The text described gravitas not as a mood, but as a substance. It was the quality of having weight. It was the ability to remain grounded when the winds of fortune blew. For the Roman soldier or statesman, gravitas meant that one did not float aimlessly. One had mass. One had dignity that could not be easily displaced. Nico stood in the narrow aisle of the bookstore, the smell of old paper and dust filling his lungs, and read the passage again. He felt a jolt of recognition. He had spent the last 6 months trying to float. He was trying to float above the failure, to rise above it, to transcend it with positive thinking and productivity hacks. He was trying to be weightless. He realized that his problem was not that he had failed. His problem was that he had no weight to withstand the failure. He had based his self-respect on external validation, on the praise of patients, and the approval of the medical board. When that validation was removed, he collapsed because he had no internal ballast. The Romans understood that failure was inevitable. It was an externality, a chaotic variable. What mattered was the internal mass of the individual. He closed the book. The sounds of the city outside, the honking horns and the chatter of pedestrians seemed to recede. For the first time in months, he felt the faint hum of a different perspective. He saw his failure not as a verdict, but as a test of his mass. He bought the book for $8. It was a small transaction, but it marked the beginning of a seismic shift in the ground beneath his feet. Nico returned to his office, but the building on Boylston Street looked different to him now. It was no longer just a temple of medicine. It was a fortress he had to navigate. He sat at his desk and opened the small leather book again, reading by the light of his desk lamp. He moved from gravitas to the second principle that formed the core of the ancient technology, Constantia. If gravitas was the weight, Constantia was the grip. It is the virtue of steadfastness, of standing firm. It is the root of the English word constancy. The Romans used this term to describe the ability of a soldier to hold the line in battle, to maintain formation even when the enemy charged. It was not a passive state. It was an active, muscular holding of one's position. The metaphor used in the text was architectural. The Roman arch. The stones in an arch do not support the structure by being strong in isolation. They support the structure by pressing against each other by the force of their mutual resistance. They hold the line. Constantia is the refusal to be displaced by panic, by grief, or by shame. Nico looked at his calendar. In 20 minutes, he had a meeting with the department head, Dr. Aris Thorne. Thorne was a brilliant but abrasive administrator who had been highly critical of Nico since the incident. In the past, Nico would have entered that meeting with a posture of apology. He would have tried to be agreeable, to smooth things over, to be weightless in the hope that the criticism would pass through him without resistance. He would have over-explained, his voice rising in pitch, his eyes darting around the room. He would have abandoned his own position to seek the safety of the other person's approval. But Nico had adopted a new behavior based on the principle of Constantia. He was not going to fight. He was not going to flee. He was going to stand. He straightened his spine. He slowed his breathing. He rehearsed the idea that his self-respect was not on the table during this meeting. His job performance was on the table, but his dignity was a fixed point. The meeting began precisely at 2000 p.m. Dr. Thorne sat behind a large mahogany desk, a piece of furniture that seemed designed to intimidate. He opened a file. It was a review of Nico's recent patient feedback. "Nico," Dr. Thorne began, his voice sharp, "we need to discuss the retention rates. Some of your patients have cited a lack of confidence in your recent sessions. They feel you are distracted, distant. This is a service industry, doctor. We sell certainty. Do you understand?" The old Nico would have crumbled. He would have apologized profusely, promising to do better, admitting to his stress, and exposing his vulnerability to a man who saw vulnerability as a weakness. But Nico applied the principle. He held the line. He looked Dr. Thorne in the eye. He did not blink rapidly. He did not fidget. He let the silence sit for a moment, utilizing the weight of gravitas. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady. "I understand the concern regarding patient perception, Dr. Thorne. I am addressing the specific clinical issues in my supervision. However, I will not compromise the integrity of my sessions by performing a version of confidence that isn't genuine. My patients need a stable presence, not a performance. That is what I am providing." The room went silent. Dr. Thorne paused, his pen hovering over his notepad. He had expected a defense. He had expected an excuse. He had not expected Nico to hold his ground without attacking back. He looked at Nico, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in months. He saw a change. He saw a man who was not asking for permission to be there. Dr. Thorne cleared his throat and looked back at his papers. "See that the clinical work remains tight," he muttered, the wind taken out of his sails. "That will be all." Nico stood up, nodded once, and walked out of the office. He did not feel a rush of adrenaline or a spike of anxiety. He felt something far more profound. He felt the ground beneath his feet. He had faced the external enemy, the pressure of his superior, and he had not moved. The ancient principle had worked. He had regained a fraction of his self-respect, not by fixing the problem, but by holding his position in the face of it. The victory in Dr. Thorne's office was a tactical success, but the war for Nico's self-respect was far from over. That evening, the adrenaline faded, and the old narrator in his mind returned with a vengeance. This is the internal enemy. It is a voice that does not shout, but whispers with terrifying precision. It speaks in the language of pathology, using the very knowledge Nico has acquired against him. He sat in his apartment in the South End, the exposed brick walls that he once found charming, now feeling like the interior of a cell. The voice told him that his behavior in the meeting was not gravitas. It was a defense mechanism. It was compensation. It was the false self acting out a charade of strength to cover up the rotting core of his failure. He felt the suffocating weight of imposter syndrome. In the clinical world, there is a term for this: cognitive distortion. He knew the term, he taught the term. Yet knowing the map does not mean one is immune to getting lost in the territory. He felt that he was a fraud, a man playing dress-up in a Roman costume, pretending to have dignity when he was actually just a 37-year-old psychologist who had broken the most sacred rule of his profession: do no harm. Nico needed a bridge. He needed to know that the ancient intuition he was following was not just a philosophical parlor trick, but something with structural integrity. He walked over to his bookshelf where his medical textbook sat juxtaposed with the small leather volume of Seneca. He pulled down a text on trauma and resilience. He turned to a chapter on the concept of post-traumatic growth, a phenomenon where individuals who face significant psychological challenges do not just recover, but find a deeper sense of meaning and capability. He read the data. Studies from the field of positive psychology show that the human brain is wired for adversarial growth. The neural pathways associated with resilience are not innate. They are constructed. They are built through the process of overcoming. Neuroplasticity dictates that every time an individual resists the urge to collapse under stress, the prefrontal cortex strengthens its regulatory control over the amygdala, the fear center of the brain. Nico stopped reading. He looked at the numbers, the charts, the clinical language. Science was validating the Roman code. The Romans did not have MRI machines. They did not have longitudinal studies, but they had empirical observation of the human spirit. They called it Constantia. Modern science calls it stress inoculation. The principle is identical. Failure is not a verdict. It is weightlifting for the mind. The collapse he felt was not a sign that he was broken. It was the sensation of his mental architecture being pushed to its limit. If he pushed back, if he applied the pressure of gravitas, the structure would grow stronger. If he collapsed, he would remain weak. He realized that his self-respect was not something he could find again, like a set of lost keys. It was something he had to forge. He felt a profound sense of relief wash over him. The guilt of the past did not vanish, but it transformed from a crushing stone into a tool. He was not a victim of his failure. He was a subject in the laboratory of his own life. He closed the textbook. He committed fully to the path. He would not apologize for his existence anymore. With the science aligned, Nico entered a deeper phase of his transformation. It was one thing to understand the concept of gravitas. It was another thing entirely to bear the weight of it. He was about to encounter the third pillar of the Roman system, the one that cuts the deepest. It is the Stoic principle of amor fati. It is not enough to merely endure one's fate. One must love it. This is the most difficult of the ancient teachings. It requires the individual to look at the specific catastrophe of their life, the failure, the humiliation, the loss, and embrace it, not as an obstacle, but as the necessary plot twist in the narrative of their greatness. For Nico, at age 37, this was an existential crisis. He was not a child. He was not a student. He was a man in the prime of his career. The feeling of time passing was acute. He felt the pressure of his age. He should be established. He should be publishing. He should be secure. Instead, he was rebuilding from zero. He walked through the Boston Common late one night, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and the distant salt of the harbor. He stood by the monument to Colonel Robert Gould Shaw and the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, a bronze relief depicting soldiers marching to war. He looked at the faces of the men in the sculpture. They marched toward a certainty of pain and death, yet their posture was upright. They possessed Constantia. Nico realized he had been fighting his failure. He wanted to erase the last 6 months. He wanted the lawsuit to disappear. He wanted the memory of the patient to vanish. He wanted to go back to being the golden boy of the department, but that desire was the source of his misery. He was trying to live in a world that did not exist. The Stoic principle forced him to confront reality. The failure happened. It is real. It is part of his history. If he continued to wish it away, he was fragmenting himself. He was rejecting a part of his own timeline. The breakthrough came like a sudden clearing of the fog. He stopped fighting. He stopped wishing for a different past. He stood in the dark park and whispered the words to himself, "I accept it." It was not a resignation to defeat. It was an acceptance of the material. A sculptor does not hate the marble. He does not hate the crack in the stone. He incorporates the crack into the design. Nico decided that this failure was his marble. The breakdown of his confidence was the rough edge that would define his future character. He felt a profound shift in his identity. He was no longer Dr. Rodriguez, the fallen expert. He was Nico Rodriguez, the man who failed and survived. He was a man being trained by the universe. The shame that had been a stone in his gut became a grounding weight in his chest. He was no longer a victim of his circumstances. He was the architect of his own reconstruction. He walked out of the park with a slower, heavier step. He was no longer rushing to escape his past. He was walking with it. The change in Nico was not immediately obvious to the casual observer, but in the specific context of his workplace and his life in Boston, the contrast was sharp. The old Nico was a man of frantic movement. He was always available, always checking his phone, always trying to please. He would agree to extra shifts. He would sit on committees he didn't care about. He would rush from the hospital to the gym to social events, terrified of missing out to terrified of stopping. The new Nico operated with a different tempo. It started in his office. He cleared the clutter. He removed the distractions. When he entered a session with a patient, he was no longer performing competence. He was present. He applied the principle of Constantia in his clinical work. He sat with the patients in their pain without rushing to fix it. He modeled the very steadiness he was learning. He became a container for their chaos rather than a participant in it. The transformation extended to his navigation of the city. Boston is a city of aggressive drivers and sharp elbows. In the past, Nico would weave through traffic, anxious to get to his destination. Now he moved differently. He walked down Newbury Street with a measured pace. If someone bumped into him, he did not apologize reflexively. He simply held his line. This is the concept of territory. The Romans were obsessed with boundaries. Nico began to enforce his boundaries. He stopped taking calls on weekends. He stopped attending the department mixers where gossip and politics were the currency. When Dr. Thorne asked him to take on an overload of administrative work, Nico declined, citing his current clinical load. He did not offer an excuse. He simply said, "I cannot give that the attention it requires." The old Nico would have feared retaliation. The new Nico knew that his value was not in his compliance, but in his weight. The result was immediate and striking. His patients noticed. His retention rates, which had been dipping, began to stabilize. They did not stay because Nico was nice or accommodating. They stayed because he was solid. They respected him. The nurses in the hospital, who used to see him as the stressed doctor who was always rushing, began to treat him with a new deference. He was no longer exhausted. He was effective. He was not perfect. He still had days when the memory of the failure stung. But the sting was no longer a poison. It was a reminder of the scar tissue that made him stronger. He had reclaimed his territory. He had turned his life from a chaotic flight into a steady march. The journey of Nico Rodriguez through the streets of Boston serves as a map for the lost. The Roman principles he discovered are not just words on a page. They are technologies of survival. Gravitas taught him that dignity is not granted by others. It is a weight that one carries within. Constantia taught him that stability is not the absence of trouble, but the refusal to be displaced by it. The Stoic filter taught him to accept the raw material of his life, even the jagged edges of failure, and use them to build a stronger foundation. He learned that self-respect is not recovered by erasing a mistake. It is recovered by carrying the mistake with honor, using it as the forge for a new character. Nico sits in his car, parked on a hill overlooking the Charles River. It is winter again. The water is gray and steel blue. The skyline of Boston is etched against the cold sky. He is 37 years old. He is a clinical psychologist. He is a man who failed. He is a man who rebuilt. He holds a cup of coffee, the steam rising in the freezing air. He is not thinking about the lawsuit. He is not thinking about the future with anxiety. He is simply looking at the city, feeling the weight of his own existence. He is comfortable in the silence. The frantic need to prove himself has dissolved. In its place is a quiet, iron conviction. He knows that whatever comes next, he will be able to withstand it. He has regained his respect, not because he won, but because he refused to stay down. The ancient Greeks had a word for this type of time, kairos. It is the critical moment. It is the instant when the arrow leaves the bow. For Nico, the crisis was over. The training was complete. He started the engine, the sound of the motor humming in the quiet air. He was ready to return to the world, not as a perfect man, but as a real one. The Romans built structures that lasted 1,000 years because they understood that the foundation is everything. Failure is just the first layer of the foundation. It is the rough stone. If you reject it, you build on sand. If you accept it, you build on a rock. The lesson is simple and heavy. You do not find your self-respect in the applause of the crowd. You find it in the quiet hours when the battle is over and you are still standing.